Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Let's Summarize Ministries. I'm Micky Emerson, and this is part of the Christ-Centered Men. And as some of you may know, I've been going through the book of Judges. I've been covering each one of the judges one by one. I've written a paper on each one of them. You can find them on our website, fccop.info. And we've journeyed through them all, and we only have one judge left, the infamous Samson. Samson is so much to say about him, chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 of the book of Judges, that I devoted two papers to Samson. One pre-Delilah and one Delilah fourth. So that's what we've got going on. And what I've written is that the striking oddity as it pertains to Samson with respect to the book of Judges is that he never actually appears to judge Israel. Now you will see that I'll kind of go back and forth a little bit on my thoughts and commentary on Samson, because my way of thinking about him fluctuates as I read about him and as I write about him, because you get this personal appeal for these people as you read about them and you write about them. And so you will notice the fluctuation in the way I talk about him. But he does not go through life, what he doesn't go through life humbly and quietly like some of these previous judges. What he does, he goes through life as like the one-man wrecking crew against the Philistines right up until the very end. And as the most well-renowned of all the judges and one of the most intriguing historical figures outlined in the scriptures, we get to see a man whose birth and position in life was foretold by the messenger of the Lord, and Samson will go through life really as an immature man-child. Now, we love the story of his strength, but we must remember that it was not his strengths. It was the strength that belonged to the Lord. So we must recognize that as intriguing as he was, he may not have been responsible with the strength that he was given. And just as God equipped Samson with this wonderful gift, he has made us responsible for certain gifts. And so we will keep that in mind, and we'll discuss that later on. But right now to Samson. As Samson came of age, we'll say 18-ish, all right, he went to Canaanite city of Timnah, where he was smitten by a young Philistine woman. And let it be known that the Lord had made it abundantly clear that the Jews are not to intermingle with the Philistines. And it had nothing to do with genealogy or foreign women, but it had to do with the idolatry of their worship, the way that they lived their lives. God tried to protect the purity of the Israelites, of his people, and this was going to get in the way of that. Now, his parents attempted to dissuade him, saying, "Surely you can find a woman here. Take one of your cousins, rather than this Philistine." But he was adamant, and he insisted that they arrange for this marriage for him. Now, during the journey to Timnah with his parents, Samson comes across a lion, and he does battle with this lion, defeating it easily, tearing it like one would a young goat. Now, I don't really know who tears a young goat, but I suppose to Samson that was an easy day's work. But during this escapade, he had apparently stepped away from his parents, and maybe he had gone off in the night for some serenity to pray, but nonetheless, his parents were unaware of these exploits, and he never made them privy to it either. Now, the arrangement of the marriage in ancient Hebrew tradition was a huge ordeal, and the process would seem odd to Western culture today, but it's still practiced in certain circles of the world. A man would be smitten by a woman. He would inform his parents would meet her parents, an arrangement would be made to exchange goods for the young lady, and once an arrangement had been made, the parents and the groom would return home until the bride and her parents had put the wedding and the feast in order. And we could also discuss how that the relation between that and the Lord's Supper as well, where you would get to see the proposal being made from the father, from the groomsman to the bride, handing her the glass of wine. If she accepted the glass of wine, then she was accepting his covenant of marriage. All right, and so we get to see, the the similarities between that and the Lord's Supper. And then they would depart, go home, and the father would begin building on more rooms to the home for him and his bride and children that they may have. And so these homes would get larger and larger. And so when Jesus says, I'm going to a place, many rooms, and I'm preparing it for you, we get to see that similarity to the Hebrew marriage customs. But then the groom and his parents, they would return, they'd partake of a 7-day feast and a festival prior to the nuptials. And after 7 days of celebration, vows would be exchanged, and the bride and the groom would consecrate their marriage. Now, as this pertains to the lion, and then we're going to go back to the lion, this event would have taken place on the way to introduce his parents to the young lady. Now, the journey from Zorah to Timnah would be approximately 4 miles, about 3 hours, without the roads and wonderful features that we have today. But after the lion and an introduction, him and his parents will return home to gather their things in preparation for the wedding feast. And then they would return just a couple of short days later. Upon that return, Samson comes along to the carcass of the lion that he's slain. And alas, there is a swarm of bees has developed inside the carcass, leaving honey, which entices Samson to gather up a handful of honey for himself, and then shares it with his parents, who were not familiar with the lion or the location of the honey. Number one, to me, it's absolutely appalling to scrape honey out of a dead carcass. All right. Number two, as a Nazirite, he had taken a vow not to touch anything impure in all of his days. And you can get that from the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verse 6, if you want to look that up. And number three, he shares this tainted honey with his parents without hesitation. That's gross, and that is just simply immature. And it shows a total lack of awareness of God's law. But that's neither here nor there. While God did not punish him for his actions, what we have is his lack of devotion. But that lack of devotion is met with God's mercy and grace for not punishing him for his actions, along with his lack of acknowledgement for God's mercy and grace. Now, of course, from the outside looking in, we have this bird's eye view of this situation. But at the same time, how often do we make questionable choices? Do we disobey God's law? And do we fail to recognize the mercy and the grace that he has upon us when we do such things? So it's, again, like I said, you'll see me flip-flop on the way I think and talk about Samson. But we can totally relate to this gentleman and his actions. Now, on to the wedding feast. They get back, and they're at this wedding feast of this Philistine woman whose name we never get, much like Samson's mother. But we're told on a couple of occasions that the marriage to her was to secretly fulfill God's purpose. And I must confess that I am totally unaware of what that purpose may have been, other than to maybe wreak havoc on her community, which we'll get to shortly. As Samson arrives to work the feast that will lead up to his nuptials, he's joined by 30 Philistine men who are going to help and be his groomsmen. But I really get the notion that they were to make a sport of him. And so what they do is that they're making a sport of Samson. So he gets a little frustrated with them and gives them a riddle. And so the stipulation to this riddle, if they get it, they have to solve the riddle. They have to provide 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. If they don't, or he has to provide that to them. If they don't figure out the riddle, they have to provide those things for him. So he tells them, out of the eater comes something to eat, and out of the strong comes something sweet. Now, you and I know that he's talking about the lion and the honey, but they don't know this. So what they do is, to determine the answer, after quite some time, they provoke his fiancée to entice the answer out of him. And so they give him the answer, and so what does he do? He goes and he slays 30 Philistines and gives them their clothes. But after gifting them their garments, he couldn't bring himself to wed the woman. And so he goes home to his father's house to assess his life and the situation, and he's undecided on what to do. that's when he decides that he's going to go back. But while he's been gone, his best man has consummated marriage with his fiancée. So, burning with anger, what he does, he ties the tails of 30 foxes together with some torches, and he connects them and releases them into the distance, resulting in flaming demise of 3 of the Philistines' main crops, including grain, vineyards, and groves. And with anger upon anger, the Philistines retaliate by setting fire to his former bride and her dad. So this results in yet another retaliation from Samson in the form of a great slaughter that we're not really given the details of, other than it was a great battle. So, how often have we lost our temper? Maybe not to that extreme, maybe not to that extent, I hope not. But how often have we lost our temper? I do it on a daily basis. All right? How often have we had this lapse of integrity? Let our emotions get the best of us. And when that happens, what the best avenue of approach is to step back, breathe, meditate, have a conversation with the Lord, reassess the situation, and He will humble us, and He'll reform our frame of mind. And I like to think that this is what Solomon did. Of course, it was too late. He had already caused all this damage. But I think once he had caused the damage, he was able to stop and say, what in the world did I just do? And so that's when he steps away, and he's going to venture out. And he decides that he's going to wander to the east to the valley in Benjamin called Etam. Now, maybe he ventured that way to proclaim the Lord, since he was a judge. However, I feel that given the circumstances, he sought out solace. At this point, a young Solomon had attempted to get married to a Philistine woman, been duped, and made a sport of by her friends, using her as leverage. Because of his anger, lost his bride to his best friend, had been responsible for the slaying of several Philistines and 3 of their crops, and it was also during the month of harvest, just to make matters worse. So surely he knows that they will retaliate. People are going to be upset. So he's decided that he's going to go to this cleft, clear his thoughts, and be alone with the Lord, which is probably the best thing that any of us could do. But retaliation is what the Philistines seek, and they will use the Israelites to bring him in. So if you're please following along, if you get done with this podcast, look up the book of Samson, chapters 13 through 16. You'll be able to catch up where I'm at right here. But the Philistines gather a group of Israelites to bring in Samson. So as 1,000 or more venture into Judah, possibly somewhere between Jerusalem and Jericho, seeking out Solomon, they're met by a slew of Jews who are concerned with the number of Philistines. The number is so great that they believe that there is an invasion at hand. And only to discover that the large number of men are seeking the one judge of God. Now, in an attempt to keep the peace and avoid any bloodshed, what do? They offer to bring in Solomon. So, how cowardly and submissive the Israelites had become. They had this opportunity to slay captors, but instead decided to be subservient to their captors. The problem with this is that sometimes oppression can become so comfortable that we no longer recognize it. Much like the sin that we live in our lives before we find the Lord. We just become comfortable with that. And so as 3,000 men of Judah approach Solomon, who has sought solace at the cleft of Etam, they find and they begin to rebuke him. So poor Solomon's got 3,000 Jews yelling at him. That had to be tough. But don't you know the Philistines are our rulers, they said? What have you done? It's almost as if the thought of freedom or joining along with Solomon to defeat the Philistines hadn't even crossed their mind. They hadn't even thought about conquering their masters. And surely the exploits of his strength and adventures had been the talk of Israel and Judah. So why they wouldn't just join him to strike down the Philistines is beyond me. I don't know. But they could have joined forces and done that within a matter of days. Instead, what they do to avoid dispute and to ensure that there's no animosity between them and their oppressors, What do? They bind Samson with 2 new ropes after an assurance that the Philistines will not harm him. So, Scripture says that there were 3,000 men of Judah and 1,000 Philistines at this point. So the men of Judah could have likely slayed the Philistines without even going to Samson. But again, the strength of the oppression of our minds can be absolutely numbing and binding, giving us a sense of inferiority when it simply isn't so. Now, as Samson is led to the Philistines in bondage, I ponder at what might have been going through his mind. What was he thinking about at that point? A plan to slay the Philistines? Was he thinking of disappointment in his fellow countrymen? Was he thinking about prayers to the Lord for strength and guidance, bafflement at the circumstances of his life? All of the above. But nonetheless, the men of Judah lead him to the Philistines, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson so that the ropes fall off of them as if they have been singed, and he spots, of all things, the jawbone of a donkey. So he's unbinded, the rope falls from his eyes, and what does he spot? A donkey's jawbone. He picks up the jawbone and just begins to slay his oppressors. He probably could have done it with his bare hands, but why not the jawbone of a donkey? Right? So it does not say how long it took, and it does not give details, but I can imagine that the neighborhood had heard the commotion. They'd come to gawk, and I can only imagine that the men of Judah looked on in amazement, and likely hung their heads after the slaughter and like, wow, I can't look you in the eyes now, Samson, I'm so sorry. But it had to have been difficult for him to look them in the eyes after the betrayal. And it's at this moment that Samson names the location Ramath Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill in the Hebrew. And he calls upon the Lord to quench his thirst, because he's worked up a sweat, he's worked up a thirst, slaying 1,000 Philistines. And so the Lord splits this rock. He splits this hollow place so that water may flow, a la Moses. And so Samson quenches his thirst, names that location in Hakor, which means fountain of him that called or prayed. So the first part of Samson's life is full of detail and drama that we do not see from the other judges. The only other judges that are devoted this kind of time are Gideon, Deborah, and Ehud, and they don't even come close to this much. And while they're given detail, it doesn't quite match up to what we're given with Samson, and we're only in the first stage of his life. The conclusion of chapter 15 says that Samson judged Israel for 20 years. And near the beginning of this paper, I stated that it seemed peculiar that he never actually seems to judge Israel, because there never seems to be the typical judgment that you see from the other judges. Chapter 16 will begin with his journey to Gaza and his love for Delilah. So I surmise that somewhere between 15 and 16, or from 15 on, the judgment of Samson is likely to take place. At this current period of time, I would guess that Samson is a young man, 18 to 21 years old, just old enough to have sown his oats and taken time to come to his own and get to know the Lord and what the Lord has blessed him with. He had shown his love for the ladies, his regard for foreign women, that he was willing to drink wine, and his famous temper. And this is not what you would expect from a judge of the Lord. And it's certainly not what you would expect from a divine Nazarene. But the young man needed time to grow, much like the rest of us. He was human. So while we see his growth, his stumbling, his setbacks, we also see the Lord's patience. We see his mercy and his grace. So throughout all the trials of Samson, God allowed him to suffer the consequences of his actions, while also providing him strength and water at the same time to give him another day, because God's divine gifts are laid out for all of those who obey and who don't obey. All right, the Lord allows the sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous alike, so that maybe one day the unrighteous can see the glory of God and turn to him. That's why he does what he does. So that concludes the first episode of Samson. I want to thank you all so much for joining us, and I pray that you come back for episode number 2, where we'll get to dive into his love for Delilah and his taken down of the temple. So thank you. God bless, and have a wonderful day.